noticing one's own speaking voice changing as an instrumentation of measurement of the spirit's presence and movement and virtues and things like that. So conjuration is not just about pulling a spirit to you, it's also about feeling the rope of the spirit pulling back.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are esoterically elated to be discussing the art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings with contemporary cunning man, Dr. Alexander Cummins. Some magicians and practitioners of the grimoire arts might be very familiar with the 72 spirits listed, for example, in the Lemegeton's Goetia grimoire, but who are the four kings of the four cardinal directions? Why are the four kings so important to grimoiric and Solomonic magical procedures? How can we engage with these powerful regions of directionality? And what does it even mean to have a hierarchy of spirits? Well, our next guest is one of the best people to ask. Dr. Alexander Cummins, contemporary cunning man, author, historian, and poet. Dr. Al is no stranger to deep-delved research, practical application of ritualistic kinetics, and a pioneering spirit of experimentation and finding new ways to conjure and call. Dr. Al is also no stranger to the podcast, and I definitely encourage listeners, if you haven't already, check out the previous appearances of Dr. Cummins, where he shares great wisdom on a variety of magical, esoteric, and Solomonic-themed topics and more. But in this episode, Dr. Cummins stops by to share about his latest tome from Hadean Press, The Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings, an early modern experiment of Cyprianic conjuration. The Art of Cyprian, found in MS Sloane 3850, contains instructions for the construction and use of a magical mirror attributed to Saint Cyprian of Antioch. Dr. Cummins, as usual, offers readers new ways to conceptualize the true roles of the four kings. He offers practical tips and lessons learned on executing the rite of Cyprian's mirror itself, as detailed in the text. And Dr. Cummins also shares about the nature of hierarchies, shifting roles, and the malleability that can be gleaned from the source works. I also want to thank each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your excellent questions for Dr. Cummins, which, as usual, were wonderful. And a huge thanks to Dr. Al himself, in addition to everything else, for his patience and generosity of spirit in putting up with multiple ridiculous internet outages on my end while we were recording. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back to the podcast contemporary cunning man, Dr. Alexander Cummins. Dr. Alexander Cummins, thank you so much for returning on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. Gosh, no, it's always a pleasure to get to talk. You have a great concise way of making me sound like I know what I'm talking about, which is helpful for both of us, I guess. No, it's great to be back here. Thank you.
Well, that's entirely your fault, Dr. Al, because you do know what you're talking about, which is just I'm not sure what that feels like, but I imagine it feels like a horrible curse to have thrust upon you. Dr. Al, you always tackle subjects that, are very, very light and airy, not weighty at all. Things like, I don't know, the Four Kings. And so this is such a lovely book, Dr. Al. And before we get into the book itself, can you share with us, maybe to set the stage a little bit, about the Four Kings, these four regents of the four cardinal directions, especially if there might be listeners out there for the first time hearing about the Four Kings?
Absolutely. So you hit the nail on the head almost immediately there. So I can, again, just kind of slingshot off your excellent setups, which is great for me. If you've engaged with European spirit work, or especially, grimoires of, these manuals of spirit conjuration, of formal ritual magic and conjuration, you'll be aware that spirits often have titles. They often have ranks, Duke such and such. And king is no exception. So there are a wealth of kings in these grimoires, a wealth of unclean spirits is one of the terms that's often used, but a wealth of various spirits who consider themselves kings or turn up in a kingly way, or crucially seem to boss other spirits around or send them forth or receive them in their court. So if you're not familiar with them at all, the important thing to bear in mind is that these particular four kings usually come in four. They're a gang. They're a set by the whole series. And that they stand, as you've so eloquently put, at the compass points, the thorns of the compass rose, right? At the crossroads of north, south, east, and west. The term that's used sometimes is cruciatus locus, right? We can appeal to, say, a 13th century account by Cecco d'Ascoli, right? I'm probably pronouncing that terribly. Those four spirits of great virtue who stand in cruciatus locus, right? At the crux of things, right? The crux, right? That is in east, west, south, and north, whose names are as follows: Oriens, Amemon, Paimon, and Egim, who are spirits of the major hierarchy and who have spirits under them, says Cecco. So the names, I think we'll definitely get into, the names sometimes shift a little bit, and they are not the only kings who are found at the crossroads of the cardinal directions, but they, certainly by the early modern period, come to a prominence from their earlier iterations in the medieval work, and we'll get into some of that as well. They are also called the four principal spirits, and they license the operator to call spirits under them. So this is classic phone tree networking for spirit callers, right? For spirit summoners, that you call a spirit and they may go forth and find another spirit to send you. Oh, I know a guy, right? It's a referral kind of thing. But more often it's that you are approaching these kings and asking that, as they are king of this particular direction, you are the king in the east, for instance, that you can both ask for them to send spirits from the east and also understand that there are eastern courts and spirits who therefore have an association with this particular king or ruler or regent, as I prefer when I'm trying to distinguish between all the other spirits that are sometimes called kings as well.
You say, quote, put simply, the four cardinal princes form one basis of the earthly structure of early modern grimoiric Goetia. Can you elaborate on that? Because exactly one of the things I remember years ago when I first, opened the Lemegeton's Goetia, and exactly what you say, Dr. Al, I was going, wait a second. So, Baal or Baal is a king, let's say, but wait a second. Then there are these four other kings, and, things can seem a bit shifty, but you're saying that these four kings are specifically in the hierarchical position above, if we could use that terminology, some of the other spirits that one might find in grimoiric spirit registers.
Right. Yeah. They're big spirits. That's the technical term, right? They're spirits that license other spirits and that are said to command potentially be able to command any spirit coming from their direction, which I think is really significant. We see their importance in how often, say, the scrying records attached to the excellent book of the Art of Magic that I was lucky enough to work on with my friend and colleague, Phil Legard. The journal has an awful lot of entries. It's the standard thing when they say they saw a spirit. They tell you what direction it came from and what direction it left in. These are not just about what direction do I face to call the spirit properly. They're also about ensuring that I know what to do when the spirit turns up because I've checked with their boss, right?
What is the connection between Saint Cyprian of Antioch and the four kings? As you say in the book, quote, Saint Cyprian of Antioch, as he appears in the Goetic Conjuration and necromancy of the early modern British Isles, has strong connections to the four regent spirits of the cardinal directions. That's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah. So what I'm mostly interested in is I keep returning to one of the versions of the manuscript called the Thesaurus Spiritum, the Treasury of Spirits. And in that, not only is that grimoire said to have been written by Roger Bacon, and to also seem to have a general patronage, we might say, sought from St. Cyprian of Antioch. So the De Nigromancia encourages you to go and receive a mass of St. Cyprian before you do any big conjuration works, and that you should also give money, potentially give money like on the book, that the act of almsgiving should be something that the book is employed with, that you said to give a crown or a half crown, like a coin, on the book into the collection plate. it is clear that there's some kind of like, I don't want to say initiatory, but some kind of opening rite of going and receiving this Mass of St. Cyprian, right? The main detail, however, whereby we seem to understand the connection between Cyprian and the four regents, the four kings, seems to come in De Nigromantia when it says that the book of St. Cyprian, a famous book, the infamous spell book of this patron of grimoire magicians and of necromancers, this book, the De Nigromantia reports, it describes the Book of the Offices of Spirits, which is itself a genre and a set of particular manuscripts that are important in the history of Goetic grimoiric magic because they arrange the spirits by their direction, right? Which we've already talked about, right? These are the spirit. This is the king in the east, and these are the spirits under that king. You will call forth or ask for the authority of the king, and then they may well send forth one of these spirits. Or you may summon that spirit and they may send forth a familiar or an intermediary spirit of their own as well. It can be, as I'm discovering, intermediaries all the way down. But the point here is that you are attempting to understand that the four principal spirits that form the basis of this kind of king work are themselves said to have been summoned by Cyprian, and that there are various hints throughout a bunch of grimoiric manuscripts in the 15th and 16th century in the English record that I'm familiar with, where appeal to Cyprian is made not just as abstractly, this is the saint you speak to about dealing with demons, but that some of these working books may include instructions said to be from Cyprian directly. One such example is the text that gets called the Book of the Danelle, which has a bunch of stuff about summoning Asmodai, but within that it also says, so as Cyprian saith, when he conjured Asmodai, people think he's under this spirit, but actually he's under this other spirit. And here are some other specific conjuration protocols that I, Cyprian, am now telling you in the book. So the simple answer is that the connection is that grimoiric and folk grimoiric at that operations for dealing with the dead and unclean spirits especially, but also angels occasionally, throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, keep associating Cyprian and the four kings. And then when we look at, say, one example of that association, like the De Nigromantia, and saying the Book of the Offices of the Spirits is the Book of Cyprian, that's pretty much what the De Nigromantia says, which is meant to be Roger Bacon's words. Roger Bacon, who is himself a devotee of Cyprian. And so there's a wealth of practice and theory going on. On the one hand, we get operations said to have been done by Cyprian, like this Mirror of Four Kings. And on the other hand, we get his conjuring notes, his backseat conjuring, if you will, saying, when I summoned Asmodai, it actually wasn't with a ruler in the north. He was his own thing. And again, this gives us the sense that as you read more and more of the grimoiric corpus, it becomes apparent that the same characters are turning up in slightly different configurations and with slightly different specific working protocols and things like that. And one of the things exploring the Cyprianic connection to early modern English nigromancy and Goetia is that it seems that Cyprian forms this basis for a patron that not only abstractly authorizes your work, but that also you may go to about between you and spirits, you are collaborating to individualize general workings into specific workings in your working book, if that makes sense.
Yes. Wow. So it seems that Cyprian is really a pinch in the hourglass here, kind of tying together a lot of these different threads, especially as it relates to the four kings. And just to underscore this, one of the points that you make in the book, Dr. Al, how important the four kings are, and just a hierarchy in general is you mentioned that in the Lemegeton's Goetia, for example, this infamous work was the culmination of a process of redaction and removing of infernal hierarchies with Johannes Ver. Can you just share about some of this technology, if we will, or some of these grimoiric procedures, were intentionally redacted or withheld in order to render it neutered or just simply ineffective?
For sure. Yeah. So historically speaking, the lesser key, right, what we call the Lemegeton, and specifically the Ars Goetia of that, is the product of a combination of heresiographers and demonologists reporting on what, and again, we should be very clear, an early modern demonologist is someone that studies those who work with demons, not someone who works with demons necessarily, right? So yes. I want to be clear, we're talking about people saying you shouldn't be doing this, right? So Jean-Patrice Boudot has said before that the text that the Lemegeton is so obviously kind of based in, which is Vea's Prestidigis Daemonum, right, is incomplete. And they specify that we're missing details of the three chiefs and the four regents. Because the thing to bear in mind is that we don't get grimoires from people publishing them who want you to practice them. We get them as a rogues gallery of, have you seen this demon? Report to the authorities if you have, right? So we don't deal with people making this information available, funnily enough, because it's not information that an awful lot of heresiographers and demonologists want in the hands of, regular people. So one of the things they do is they seem to hamstring it. They seem to leave particular bits out quite deliberately. And I'm not the first person to point this out. Joseph H. Peterson has specifically pointed to deliberate abbreviations and omissions. He said that Vea has text that seems to be missing text at the beginning that has information on the three chiefs, Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Satan. In other manuscripts families, that's Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. But the point is that there are three chiefs of hell. Hell is a triumvirate, right? As anyone that's read The Sandman will know. So you have these three chiefs in or of hell, and then you have the four cardinal points and the chief princes or demons or kings. So you have authority in hell and authority or orientation, shall we say, on earth. So how would you stop someone being able to use a grimoire while keeping all of the salacious bits that make people go, ooh, and buy your book, right? Well, one of the ways you do that is to take out the operative hierarchy, and not the hierarchy of so-and-so is under such and such and all of those particularities, but of the actual protocol of what do I do first, in what order. And that's what gets taken out, the how exactly these various 72 spirits interact with and are empowered or licensed by their superiors, for want of a better term. So exactly how these spirits talk to each other and what you do, parts of it seem to have been deliberately left out or excised in order to make it difficult to actually use it. Now, I want to be clear when I talk about the Lemegeton, because I know many people that use it and get great results from it. I'm not saying that as a grimoire doesn't work or it's broken, right? There are a variety of ways of engaging with these technologies and texts and their spirits, right? I'm not saying like my grimoire can beat up your grimoire on the astral, right? That's childish. What I am saying is that we need to acknowledge that the reason that, for instance, some of the four kings turn up in the list of the 72, like Paimon, with a long form entry, as Jake puts it. And that's, again, because the list has been kind of scrambled, and the order that one works in is not necessarily super obvious. Now, again, there is still an invocation of the kings in the Lemegeton. There are still plenty of invocations that if you have if you have your head on straight and you have the right empowerments and the right contact and you've done the prep and things, I have no doubt it would work. My point is that just because it works doesn't mean that it's always been complete. And just because you can make it work doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of something working as well. And if we pick at those layers, it seems that the four kings are a really important way that pre-modern necromancy, that the conjuration of unclean spirits seems to have worked, at least in the Grimoire magicians and cunning folk that I study.
Let's talk about MS Sloane 3850, which is the manuscript that you base your latest tome about. Can you share, listeners, how did you first become acquainted with MS Sloane 3850, and just what was the whole genesis of saying, okay, it is time to write this book?
I was trying to think about this. So I've been working on the experiment on the mirror and on the ink making and things for a good while. I don't mean as and that's why I'm very powerful. No, I messed up the ink recipe so many times, or it just wasn't doing what it should do. I think I came across it in reading old Hermetic journals. I should be clear. The booklet that we're talking about is, I'm indebted to Adam McLean of so many, great works on alchemy and so much teaching on the history and practice of alchemy. It was a chapter in one of the Hermetic journals that Adam had translated from the manuscript. And so I don't know why I was reading that Hermetic journal in the first place. I think maybe there was another article on something, I was interested in, but Cyprian caught my eye, obviously. And so I read the article, loved it, loved the practicality of making an ink so that you can make a variety of paper talismans and then ink a mirror with names. And the mirror not necessarily even being what you see the spirits in either. This older notion of a showstone or a glass or a mirror being like a locus or an anchor for a bunch of work, but that you don't literally need to use it like a screen, right? And we see this with some of the German Almandel material as well that Jan Veenstra has talked about. Because I was already experimenting with giving stones to the Four Kings from my work with the excellent book. And so this seemed like a natural extension of why not consolidate your 4 mirrors into one easy to scry mirror and consolidate all your existing spirit pacts.
To your point, Dr. Al, can you kind of sketch out just some of the broad strokes about the operation itself? So basically, this is the construction of a very specific mirror. It should be used on Saturdays. There's gold and frankincense and myrrh to be placed under the tongue during part of the preparatory part of the operation. Yes. Kings must swear by their heads. I mean, there's so many elements. Can you just give us some of the kind of start to finish, just broad strokes of what does this operation entail?
Firstly, you start with a week in, quote, chaste piety and contemplation. And we can talk about exactly what that means. But you spend a week purifying, and I say purifying, it's mostly just avoiding things, abstaining from things. The first Monday of the new moon, or how do they phrase it? What is it? The first Monday that the new moon showeth herself, which is great, right? So you have a sense of like the first time you see a sliver, right? That's how you know, not just like I can't see the moon. After you've spent that week, you construct several talismans on virgin parchment, the Great Seal, the Pentagon of Solomon, the Mortagon of Solomon. There's also a ring and a girdle. And you make these pentacles, as I say, in virgin parchment of like kid skin or lamb skin. You make a particular ink, as I've already mentioned, I think, in order to scribe these special pentacles, these special amulets. And the ink is, you have to make the ink yourself. It's made of lamp black, which you get from, specifically it wants the lamp black that you get from burning frankincense, myrrh, and thyme. And I found that using a lot of thyme was especially helpful here because resins don't necessarily give. If you're not familiar with lamp black, it's the process of holding a spoon over, sometimes it's a candle or a smoking, like a bowl. This recommends that you put a bowl over a bunch of smoking materia and then gather the soot that gathers on the bottom of the spoon or the bowl or whatever it is. It takes ages. It takes so long. But anyway, you make an ink, you have your various like talismans, and then you, on a Saturday, you take a glass, which seems to be a flat, like a glass, a mirror. You put wax around it. You build this little, almost like a Stargate looking thing that you put around the outside, and you partition that off into 4. And then you write names in the wax with the ink. And they're the names of 4 ruling spirits in the cardinal directions. And the idea is that you use that. Once you've done that, you can use that to call a ruling spirit of that direction and then ask that spirit to send you other spirits as well. It's 4 kings because it's meant to be all 4 directions. And so the idea is you can do almost whatever you want with the mirror once you, I don't mean you can do whatever you want. It can provide a basis for summoning a variety of spirits, right? It's not just limited to those 4 kings of the mirror.
You just touched on this point, Dr. Al, and it's something that I know Jake Stratton-Kent has recently touched on in his latest tome, but you mentioned that such work, quote, must also be conducted in chastity and pureness. Can you elaborate exactly what does it mean in terms of this initial preparatory aspect, and why is it so important to, not skip that, not say, oh, that's just a little thing, I want to go on to the cool stuff that's later on. Can you share about that?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different things that grimoires specify as what being clean and chaste is. Often it includes a bath, that your clothes should at least smell nice. And again, I think people early on who have been trained to look for correspondences are like, but what specific incenses should I use to make my clothes smell nice? And the answer you see in grimoires is just like, rose water, but not necessarily explicitly because it's Venus, but because it smells nice. The issue with cleansings and purifications is going to depend. Some grimoires are like 40 days. You can't even look at a member of whatever sex it is that you like. You need to burn your fingerprints off, things like that. Most of them are a week or 3 days. Most of them are about avoiding excesses, really. You are seeking to find balance. And I think that is a helpful way of thinking about it. We do get out what we put in. And if you decide you're going to skip a step that helps you prepare yourself, your body, mind, soul, spirit, to receive these things, then you are potentially doing yourself a disservice by not engaging with it. I think it's very tempting for people to, again, either say you have to do everything that the book says, and anyone that doesn't is a part-timer. And it's also very tempting to say, screw this, like you say, I'm going to jump to the good stuff, right? Do I think that if you don't do the full cleansings, that the work will just be completely inert? No. It depends which grimoire we're talking about and what kind of operations we're talking about. But in general, thinking about cleansings and purifications and preparation periods beforehand as preparing yourself, not as penance for being a filthy mortal who has to poop sometimes or do, normal human things, but rather as I am aligning myself and I'm ensuring that there are as few as possible external influences, potentially on my soul, on my health, on my mind, so that when I enter the ritual chamber, when I cast the circle, when I do the thing, when I light the incense, when I make the offering, when I make that first call, that I am in the best state that I can be in to recognize the actions and influences of spirits. That for me really is where it gets the most practical, where again, we don't need to talk about the guilt of original sin or anything like that. No. We're talking about having a clean work surface, free from distractions, so that when you make the call and you start having a vision, you know that that's because you're having a vision because the spirit is manifesting, not because you, ate some really funky cheese or something like that. That's a stupid example, but I hope you see what I'm saying. It's about establishing what our baselines are and therefore knowing what to do when things don't work, knowing what's gone wrong and working out what to do about it, which is also my perspective on why it's good to do what the book says, right? Not because purism is the only way. It's a very recent historical trend in terms of grimoire magic, but because if it doesn't work, then you need to work out what's not working about it. And if you're going totally off book and you're changing 12 different things and it doesn't do what you wanted it to do, how do you know which one of those things that you changed is the light bulb in the Christmas lights that doesn't work, that stops everything else working? And I know they work differently now with LEDs, but that's a useful analogy for me of the modularity of Grimoire protocol.
In terms of you, Dr. Al, breaking this dichotomy, I think you also do such a wonderful job in your book about examining the language itself, the language of the conjurations. And grimoires very often contain strong worded language to command spirits. And sometimes this gives the perception for people saying, well, hold on, grimoires are just simply all about ordering and hectoring spirits around, and they only contain harsh language. But could you elaborate, Dr. Al, on what you write in the book, which is when you say, quote, tensions between the sacred and the taboo inherent in such necromancy, and crucially, of the versatile switching between the dominant and submissive modalities to achieve intended results, are absolutely present in the wording of the conjurations of the four kings themselves. Can you elaborate on that? Because that is just so fascinating.
For sure. Yeah. So partly what's important to bear in mind is that there's a pre-modern context here of, again, blame Uncle Heinrich, right? Agrippa gives us these two flavors of black magic, and they also are absolutely a dividing line, right? On the one hand, you have those black magicians, those negromancers who bind devils by invocating the divine name. They're the compellers. They're the Solomonic bully boys, right? They've got their circle and they've got their sword, and they're going to make you an offer that you can't refuse, right? Then on the other side, Agrippa says, we also have those are even worse, right? Not just necromancers, but maybe even witches as well. They are those, he says, that submit themselves to devils and make sacrifice to them and adore them. And so he says, these are the two kinds. And that's the only way you can work with spirits, right? Except the actual records and working books and journals and noti seem to suggest something very, very different entirely, which is that not only do different practitioners have different takes of how much authority they give and how much authority they try and exert, but that within a practitioner's own work, within their own like conjurational praxis, they may shift. So you may start by being very, very subservient and saying how great the spirit is and how unworthy you are for them to show up. And then once they do show up, you switch it up and you show, actually, I am worthy. I am worth being talked to. I am worth you paying attention to me. And the idea that rather than it being a set of code words or a seduction script that you repeat and the spirit always turns up because you negged them at the right time, rather we deal with a dance where sometimes the spirit is going to come in hot and you need to be responsive to that. And sometimes you're going to come in really riled up about something and the spirit is going to either go with you or not go with you. But the point is, not only does it depend day to day on what you're doing with the spirit, it also depends what part of the operation you're at. Do you wheedle in with them first and do carrot then stick? Or do you do stick then carrot? Or are you doing both at once? And I am really indebted to the work of Frank Clarson and Sharon Hubbs-Wright in Magic of Rogues recently for getting more into this kind of verse of the versatile stuff. And they point out, again, not only do these conjurations combine these different kind of supplicatory languages and like subservience with outright commands and adjurations, they also show that like there's not a clear picture of exactly what tone you should strike for between those two things, between practitioners and in the transmission of these things. So they point out, so they're talking about this text and they note that one magician who has received this conjuration from another starts editing it and starts taking out a lot of the more subservient language. Text 2.5 apologizes for its obsequious language by implying that this approach was a formality for dealing with angelic, if fallen, and kingly creatures. And that's worth bearing in mind, by the way. The four kings, at least by the 17th century, at least by John Hayden's reckoning, are fallen angels, categorically. They are part of the cabal of Lucifer's followers who rebel and war on heaven and lose and get kicked out. But again, not thinking about that in terms of fallen angel, how dark, how cool, but like fallen angel, technically an angel still. Like it's a very British class system approach to this stuff. Well, he might be a devil, but he was also born of angels. And so we have this sense here of like, this could be problematic even for other necromancers. That's it. A subsequent owner of the manuscript that Clarson and Wright are talking about, that they drew from, they actually crossed out the English prayers that took the more supplicatory approach and tried to expunge the problematic phrases in the Latin prayers, such as supplico te, I supplicate you, and left in the more kind of imperious ones, such as conjuro te, I conjure you. So these manuscripts are changing between necromancers. Each necromancer seems to have a different take on exactly how much buttering up you give these spirits and how much flexing you do at them. And then on top of that, your own practice over the course of a single conjuration over a week or something, you may employ various points where you are more commanding and more commanded. And so what I think is important, again, I really just want to emphasize that for me, this highlights that this kind of conjurational spirit work can be as responsive and as dynamic as it can be a set script and a reliable conservative thing that always does what it says and always does the same thing. In my experience, my spirits aren't that consistent, and I'm certainly not that consistent.
That is so lovely, Dr. Al. And so for the listeners out there who might read for the first time some of this very strong language, or if they pick up, as I would encourage, a copy of your book, The Excellent Book of the Art of Magic, and they read about Humphrey Gilbert and his scryer, John Davies, who use incredibly, probably, I would dare to say, of course, I'll defer to you, Dr. Al, some of the strongest language and most tense and kind of severe language in terms of gathering and conjuring spirits. And if someone's reading all that, as you say, perhaps they should look at it like, okay, this is what is in the text. However, each individual operation is a dance. Each individual operation has its own cadence, its own flow, its own poetics, if you will. And that depends on you and it depends on the spirit. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. We know Gilbert was a very choleric man. He shouted at spirits. He shouted at people, as a military man and an explorer and quote explorer, right? What we call colonizers. But he was absolutely on record as screaming at his men. And his approach was exactly like their nasty conjurations. He would do an awful lot of cursing spirits of saying, God rebuke you. The angels rebuke you. St. Peter rebuke you. Like these kinds of huge lists of like getting all these saints and God to curse spirits for not turning up. As my good friend and colleague Phil pointed out, there's a certain boilerplate nature to those conjurations. They're the meaner side of the usual kind of thing that you'll find in these conjurations. But the point is they're, if not simple, they're short and repeated a lot. And Phil pointed out that this makes sense having the kind of boilerplate thing, because Gilbert seems to be the kind of person who just wants to turn up, burn some incenses and shout at spirits until they turn up. And so for him, it makes sense that they would all be very short. They'd all be pretty standard, and he would just repeat them a lot and get steadily more and more irate. There's plenty here to pull out, like choleric approaches get spirits to turn up. Now, what the spirit does once it's there is not necessarily going to be helpful, but that kind of fire that motivates, that activates, that agitates, that's a useful approach. And again, useful in the sense that spirits can turn up if you do that. How they're going to turn up, what mood they're in, how you handle them once they're there, that's on you at that point. But I think it's important that we bear in mind that the record and certain experimentation shows there isn't one right way to do this, to do many of these things necessarily, but you may find a right way for you, hopefully, right? And that right way, I hope, is one that's repeatable and stable and doesn't, make your walls bleed.
And this, Dr. Al, touches on one of the key things that you talk about in the book and also one of your own individual practices. And this is the idea and the concept of creating a physical dwelling place or an indwelling invitation for the four kings. And in this operation that you delineate in your tome, the operator basically invites the kings or begs the kings to, quote, sit down in peace in your chairs. Can you share what, Dr. Al, is the importance or the implication of having four thrones or chairs as part of the actual setup of the operation itself?
Good old ritual furniture. Okay. There's a couple bits and pieces to get at here. One is seats or chairs. The little line you raised is that you invite them to come in peace and sit in their chairs. That's in the Conjuration. That's not me being like, come and have a seat, have a cuppa, That is like, that's fully there already. That's not I decided it'd be fun to play parlor games with chairs. Seats or chairs, depending on what the translation out of the Latin was, are a long part of at least medieval demonology. The person you want to speak to about that is Adley, of course. I'm very grateful for his generous sharing of his time and research and things and getting to nerd out about conjuration of unclean spirits with him. But the idea that hierarchies of hell include different seats of power, we could say, which might be physical places in hell, but are more likely to be organizations of different spirits, that there may be 4 or 7 or however many of these seats. This is a way of talking about how this particular demonic spirit or devilish spirit is currently in charge of this seat, but it might not always be so. It's a way of talking about how a spirit also fulfills a function and an office. It's one of the ways of talking about that, as well as connecting them up in understanding who can bring forth who and who licenses who and who doesn't like who, and those kinds of things. So the idea of unclean spirits having seats is very old, is very medieval at the very least. What's going on there is not quite that, though. We aren't talking about a seat like an abstracted political office that you know the name of and can therefore conjure with, which is the thing we see in the medieval stuff. It's that you are inviting them to be present somewhere. And this, for me, brings up the debate about whether or not we are meant to, what it means to bind a spirit, what it means to bind one of these kings like Oriens or Paimon. And on the one hand, we are absolutely calling them regularly. And sometimes we can frame calling, forcing a spirit to turn up, as a kind of binding itself. We're not necessarily lashing them to send them out and go and like get you a new job or a new boyfriend or something. We aren't binding them and charging them in that sense, but we are getting them to turn up when they wouldn't otherwise. On the other hand, we have the idea of the Abramelin and things that say that you absolutely have to bind these kings, but it will take you months and it's a hell of a lot of work. But once you've bound them, you can therefore rule any spirit because in theory, they rule the spirits that come from every direction, right? Between the four of them. So they're a collect the whole set kind of thing. What I think is we get somewhere between those two. In my experience, and I've written and talked about this before, you don't have to bind the kings. You can call to them and ask them to be present and to oversee what's going on with their subordinate spirits. And we see this time and again with operations in, say, the Book of the Denel, operations like getting the four cardinal kings to send forth a familiar, right? We know this is the way, the order it's commonly done in. What we are doing when we're calling in my work with the kings, I'm not binding them, but I'm also not just asking nicely, right? I'm using language. I'm appealing to particular spirits under them, their sub-kings, their messenger kings, who seem to be some part of easing the process of calling them in the first place. So a spirit house is not a bound vessel. It's not, they are not sealed in a brass vessel. Likewise, it isn't just a haunted mirror that they can slither out of whenever they want. It's closer to that, to be honest. But the spirit houses, the seats, the chairs, therefore become a place that the spirit can cohere a little more, where its presence can be a little more felt between these formal conjurations and these, I guess the other side is formal invocation, just saying, oh, you're so great and please do whatever you want in this space, right? So a spirit house becomes a landing pad, a place for them to sit or stand. Mine were for a while. They're in the process of transformation. Were for a while mobiles that would hang from the corners of the room I was using to conjure spirits in. And they were at the cardinal points of their directions. And we can talk about exactly what that constituted whenever you want. But the idea here is that you are asking these spirits to be present and to lend their power and authority without thinking that you can nail down a fallen angel off the top of your head.
Dr. Al, just for the listeners as well, who maybe they're, hearing about the four kings and the spirit chairs for the first time, I'll be super, super generic about this, but just tell me if this is somewhat in the ballpark. So let's say you are working with a grimoire, you are standing in a consecrated circle, the charcoal is ignited, there's, incense, you've done the preparatory prayers, perhaps a prayer to God in the four parts of the circle. You have the sigil of a spirit, let's say, on a layman, either on your chest or one that you're holding. Perhaps you have a subsequent thwarting angel or an angelic sigil there as well. And then outside of the consecrated circle, you, of course, have some kind of spiritus loci, or perhaps in the Heptameron and others, just saying, uticanti cerculum, like, I beg the spirit, I beseech you to appear before the circle. But what you're saying, Dr. Al, is beyond that, physically and otherwise, in the four cardinal directions, there are these four spirit houses, these four thrones or chairs or collections of space-time that you have designated for the four kings as an invitation to witness this operation. Would that be somewhat in the ballpark? Please feel free to elaborate.
No, absolutely. Yeah. That sense of witnessing is I think really important. You're asking for their oversight on the thing, right? And that again means they don't have to turn up and micromanage. They can send forth other spirits, but the connection is live.
Can you share about or elaborate on what you share in your tome, which is when you say that you've engaged in, quote, experimentation with talismanic assemblages as spirit chairs. That is fascinating, because people might say, okay, how do you construct a spirit chair? What does it mean to have a talismanic aspect to it?
Right. So for a start, there are workings. There's a love experiment in Emus 173. It was published as of angels, demons and spirits, right? Spirits and demons. Another of Dan Harm's excellent works as follow-up to the Book of Oberon, really. And in that, it's a love spell, but it's an image, and you can consecrate the image using Oriens and other of the kings potentially. It's very obviously a Venusian spell, working with Venusian spirits as well. But that can pretty obviously, I think, be adapted for other planetary workings. But that's also categorically that we have an image magic, a making of an image thing, a fetish doll, right? Classic love magic stuff that is empowered by the kings. We have a precedent and a bit of a ritual script and a and a set of protocols, like, then find 100 names of planetary spirits to put in here, that kind of thing. So constructing these spirit bundles, there are Grimoire protocols that we can adapt, and we can empower these things. We can summon the kings to empower the thing that then helps us be empowered to work with them more, that good positive feedback loop stuff. But yes, ultimately, what it boiled down to partly was like, well, who are these kings and what are the sympathetic materia and immateria, the processes and conjurations and prayers and secrets that can be whispered and lashed onto these things? What is the king doing at its direction? What are its emblems? What is its heraldry? What's its materia that it likes working with? And assembling those things. Honestly, the bundles do have an aspect of just things they like, right? There are other set things. They've all taken like a pendulum. Some of them have taken other means of divination to be able to talk through that divination, potentially. They all have a scrying stone that I've talked about. I used like agate slices in the end. They've received gems and things that they like that as you're working with. And so those chairs, those bundles become evidence of the work done, not just I bought a bunch of stuff and threw it at a spirit and now I want it to turn up all the time and do stuff for me. You're turning up, you're saying the conjurations, you're asking them about, I've noticed you have a lot of spirits that do this under you. Could you tell me more about that? And building up like, okay, all those spirit, you have all these different bird spirits. So I'm going to try and go and visit some birds or go to places where being shown in a park, a place where birds would bathe in the dust and then taking some of that dust for a thing. These bundles, these chairs emerge as a collection of works done together as well as homework, right? I've brought you all 7 doves that you wanted or whatever, right? You are building these things up over time. So that kind of building up a physical representation of your understanding of their hierarchy and their spirits has also been very helpful for me.
To your exact point, Dr. Al, there might be people who say, oh, well, grimoiric procedure is completely, it's just a formula. It's a technology. What you're saying is, yes, of course, there is a process, there is a procedure, but when you're constructing these spirit houses, if you will, when you're using specific pieces of glass or gems and other things, this is a direct result of a one-to-one idiosyncratic, unique engagement and feedback that you're getting from a spirit, and you're building it from that. You're not building it from what's writ in the bare letters, so to speak.
Right.
Okay.
And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to publish this experiment in general. I'm still getting over historian training where I can only write about dead people. And anytime I'm like, oh, let me talk about this thing I've been working on, some of my experiments, like there's a little part of my academic brain that's like, no one cares what you think unless you can say it in other people's language and about things that happened 400 years ago, right? Right. So I'm still getting over that and trying not to be the hot, because it's also not necessarily useful, and not just in terms of like my privacy, but it's not useful for you to do exactly what I do, right?
Yes.
You have your own practice, you have your own spirits, but it is useful to know, if you tell someone you can do anything you want, there are no rules, then there's a certain paralysis that comes from that blank page syndrome, right? Of like, well, if I can do everything, anything should I start with? There's something helpful about what does it look like to find an experiment, to research it, to explore it, to try and do it, and then to try and fold it into your extant practice. I've done the Art of Cyprian's mirror. I made a mirror eventually, as I say, there were bunch of times when I tried an ink and it just didn't work and I have to start again. But I've done the operation like a handful of times on book. And then after that, I started working out how to fold it into my practice, right? And that didn't mean cutting out the bits that I didn't like or that were arduous or that didn't make me feel cool. But it did mean listening to the spirits I already work with when they turned up and were like, you already do that thing. And divining on those messages. And again, how do you show and not just tell the way that most magicians, historically speaking, fold the operations they find into their own practices, whether that's the working books of cunning folk or even, Crowley whacking in a bunch of Enochian into, and the Bornless one into his Goetia. We are magpies, and hopefully we can do that well and effectively and in a way that means we can repeat it. And again, as I say, hopefully the walls don't bleed.
If we're really looking at what true grimoiric, quote unquote, because these words are so malleable, purism means, it actually means experimenting, finding your own idiosyncratic approach to the spirits, that your own individual path is what is carved out by following the book, almost paradoxically, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, following the instructions allows you to make a good connection so that you can then receive other workings, and that spirit can recommend other spirits, and that you can get off book by going through the book. Right.
How do you phrase it, Dr. Al? It's so lovely. You've said this in previous episodes. It's doing magic so that you can get better at magic, so you can do more magic to get better results. Like, you have this lovely Ouroboros that you trace out.
Yeah. And it's something that you can see for all of their, choleric bully boy tactics. It's something you can see with the excellent book as well. I think we can look at this in terms of like the search for arcane power, that they are summoning spirits to primarily bring them books of magic, to teach them more magic so they can, I use the phrase level up, which may be useful, maybe not in some ways. They are summoning spirits to bring them more books, to learn better magic, to summon bigger spirits, to learn more magic, to, onwards and onwards and onwards. Like, the magic circle becomes a positive feedback loop, ideally. And while, as I've said before, I don't think Gilbert and Davies certainly Gilbert was burdened with an overabundance of humility. He thinks he's going to be made a literal saint. I think there is something to be said here for like, what is your conjuration practice doing for you? Like, where do you go from there once you have, started building even an endeavor towards trying to summon this spirit? What do you do once the spirit's there? How do you talk to them? How do you build a working relationship of some kind? What are you trying to do with that stuff? And so we can do conjuration about our conjuration, is I think just the simplest way I can put it. And we can learn from spirits as well as sending them out to do things.
One of the things that you do, Dr. Al, that I just love so much is you kind of blend the scholarship with your deep practical experience, and you share about, here's what I tried, here are some things that could work, here's what maybe worked for me. And of course, listeners will definitely make sure to check out the podcast and video description so that you can pick up your own copy of Dr. Al's excellent book for full details. But can you share, Dr. Al, just some of the broad strokes about just some of the practical tips, and kind of walk through wisdom that you share about things like preparing the linen, for example, or the recitations of the prayers, and working with Joseph H. Peterson as well. Is there anything about those elements that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we were talking about how do you, fold bits and pieces into your own practice and build a stable and hopefully, relatively consistent practice. Sometimes that's about huge approaches and like the order in which things are done, but sometimes it's just little bits of like this one neat trick trademark, right? So there's all sorts of bits and pieces in there. My favorite as a devotee of the three magi is there is a little protocol or notai that encourages you to put gold, frankincense, and myrrh under your tongue before you make the calls. I love the idea that the gifts of the Magi are not only scenting your words, they are they're in your mouth now. Like that which comes from your mouth has something of the Magi's gifts to them, that you are empowering yourself in this way. And for me, I have found, again, having an extant Magi devotion, that's a little piece of the tech from the Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings that I have utilized in other stuff. Now, that was the process of like divination and checking with spirits and having extant relationships of like, yes, I already have an avenue by which gold, frankincense, and myrrh can be empowered for me, right? And I can empower them. So that's a great example of finding something that, might have been specific to just that grimoire and those particular spirits, right? It might have been specific to just this mirror operation. But I have found that's a general thing that is helpful, like having something that coats the mouth in some way that adds this buff, if we like, to our conjurations. So that's something that was just a neat trick. You mentioned the linens, the magic mirror operation that we're talking about here in this Art of Cyprian specifies that the mirror needs to be kept in proper cloths. And that for me led me to look at like, oh yeah, I already do something like that with some of the conjurations of the linens that are found in the Key of Solomon. Many pentacles and tools are meant to be not displayed out on like a sword rack or something, but are meant to be wrapped up, often with certain herbs and perfumes and things to keep their virtue proper. And so I looked at what I was already doing, looked at what the current experiment that I was experimenting with required, which was, linens, and then looked, or silken cloths, and then looked to those examples in the wider Grimoire corpus to see what fulfills that role. A, that I'm already have some experience with, I have some awareness of what the spirits and the seals and sigils that go on the linens are. And then being able to see where I already have something that can do that thing without replacing one with the other or just cherry picking whatever I feel like will work. These things being based off experimentation, divination, spirit consultation, and hopefully pretty rigorously looking at did that do what I wanted it to do? Hopefully that can highlight for other people how we can usefully draw on other bits of kit and practice in the course of not having to reinvent our wheel, every time a new book comes out.
What were some of the biggest surprises that you found working with the material in MS Sloane 3850? And especially, as you've intimated, when you're combining it or maybe re-threading it or reweaving it or weaving it into this tapestry of your existing work with the Four Kings?
Sure, yeah. So this is part of the point, right? When you're encountering a work you haven't encountered, even if it seems to be in the vein of things that you are very familiar with. I'm not necessarily a stranger to Cyprianic mirror operations or works that call for cardinal spirits, for instance. But you want to be able to give it its fair due and not instantly be reviewing it based off something it isn't, being this hygromantia isn't heptameron at all, right? Or what have you. But also you already have these extant pacts and protocols and things. And so it was interesting seeing, for want of a better term, how well it fit together. So the big piece of the reason that I called the pamphlet The Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings and not the Four Kings is that the ruling cardinal spirits that are mentioned in the Art of Cyprian are not Oriens, Amemon, Paimon, Egin, etc. They are other spirits. But we have precedent that there are a variety of other spirits in the court of these regents, right? And so I was expecting to have to do from the ground up with this operation, with these spirits of the cardinal directions. I was expecting to have to make new relationships with new spirits in the four quarters. And what turned out happening was that I could combine the work I was doing with the Four Kings to open and orient and empower Conjuration. You are orienting yourself by facing the east and calling Oriens, right? You are setting the crossroads of yourself. You are standing at the center of your own world, all that kind of grounding presence stuff going on, that world axis stuff, that crossroads of all choice, chance, and change stuff. And what I found was that my work with Oriens, etc., formed an opening right to then be able to do the Mirror of Four Kings operation within that. So that was a surprise how neatly they integrated, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes, no, that spirit is just for that spirit. And you for whatever reason, I can't, haven't found a way to adapt that particular working to apply to anything else. And that spirit doesn't play nice with other spirits. But that was a surprise. The other thing, and again, I'm really wary of talking about this, like it sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, but I was already engaging with using flat stones, these agate slices. I was already putting together these spirit chairs as things that seemed right to do before I read The Art of Cyprian's talk of these chairs. And while The Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings doesn't specify you need these exact stones in agate and things in the way I was doing it, the wider notion of chairs just made sense of the kind of thing we were talking about in terms of wanting to, or being required to call to them and for them to witness and authorize, but not be bound in the more like classic Solomonic sense. So that was a really useful thing, not just because, pat myself on the back. Oh, look, I was already doing that thing. He wears a still suit like he was born to our ways. Rather just that there are other things that seem to be supporting this, and it has a context and seems to be fruitful and stable work. The other big surprise was just being prepared for dealing with a lot of the intricacies of spirit interrelationships and the various different hierarchies of spirits at the cardinal points to be immensely complicated. I was fully expecting the Four Kings that are worked with in this mirror operation, which are not Oriens, Paimon, etc., to be potentially the kings for this specific mirror, right? That these are the specific spirits for this thing. And what I found was that they responded well to my extant Four Regents work, whereby if I was working with the Eastern Court, I could do my normal opening rites and circle and whatnot, and then do my normal authorizations via Oriens, and then work with the king in the East for the mirror operation. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not making huge statements about the true nature of these ancient and powerful spirits. I'm just talking about helpful ways that I've found of working with them. And so treating Zorazabel and the various other kings of the mirror operation as subordinates or specialists within the court of the Four Regents made sense, and has also been a surprise in how readily that ritual protocol and organization lends itself to bringing in other operations around cardinal directionality or things of that nature.
We definitely have a lot of listener questions for you that I would love to get to as well, which ties directly into your book and conjure and spirit work. And our first listener question for you is from Delaney Marie. And Delaney is asking, hello, Dr. Cummins. I am interested in diving into necromancy, but I am not sure where to start. What recommendations do you have for resources? And also, what protection talismans, perfumes, and more would you recommend after working late nights in the cemetery? Delaney says, I have always been very conscious of staying clean. However, I am always looking to add more to the protection arsenal.
That's a wonderful question. And I love that we went straight from what are resources for dealing with this to what are ways I can stay clean and sharp and like live my best necromantic life. I love that that was the sequence of the line of questioning there. There are a bunch of places to start. I would say you're going to be dealing like in any magic with a combination, hopefully, of looking at the way other people have done it in the past and the way these things have been done and the way they're done in other places now, as well as, you know, in your own backyard potentially. And then marrying that and hopefully using that in a way that informs and is informed by an actual practice and experience. So I tend to stress that I think if you're going to work with the dead, work with friendly dead first. So you aren't, you know, trying to learn how to speak Spanish in a boxing ring, you know, best to learn it like with family that speaks Spanish. That's helpful, right? So I recommend people work with their ancestors to develop a sense of what the dead feel like and also to nurture their own roots so that they can nurture you in return. So all that good stuff of ancestor work. So that's one definite place to start. That also means that you have, you know, hopefully some good family dead on your side should, you know, you be walking through a graveyard and something try and take a piece out of you. In terms of specific protections, again, there are general things that are good, like good, you know, ghost hygiene and things like that. And then there may be specific strategies, observances, remediations, things to be wary of for an individual. Here's where, for me, divination becomes useful. I've emphasized again and again, I think that like I did this because I divined and it was a good idea to do and looked like I could understand the patterns of energies that were going on. Or occasionally, very occasionally, I've got no idea why a thing is doing what it's doing, but it seems to be doing it safely. You treat that with the caution and respect it deserves. So in general, it's also depending on what kind of work you're doing in a graveyard. I find turning up with bin bags and picking up rubbish is not exactly the most like arcane, spooky, how to summon your skeleton army. But I find that you make friends by showing that you care about a thing and turning up for it. And that way you can make connections in your local cemetery that can start, you know, you get referrals from one ghost to another when you need to deal with a particular matter and those kinds of things. So a lot of what I emphasize about starting necromancy actually ends up sounding pretty low key and more about like community engagement and things like that. But if you are interested, I am actually starting a whole course literally called Necromancy for Beginners. I'm doing it through the Cauldron Black and it starts near the end of March. And it's a 5-part series looking at ancestor work, working with ghosts and local dead, working with what I call great dead, which includes the mighty dead, as they're often called from Wiccan parlance, working with dead magicians, which is a particular favorite and passion of mine. But then also looking at, we have a specific class on graveyard protocols and things that are good and to bear in mind about that. And then a class on dealing with the restless dead as well. There are also, various books and things like that. I run a Facebook group that some of you may be aware of with my friends Ben and Jesse called Folk Necromancy, which has a whole book list section. There are a couple popular titles in there, and we've got people discussing them a little bit in there as well. But you can also always email me directly, and we can happy to hear more about people's practice and what might be helpful resources or training for them specifically, because it's always good to be a little bespoke in how we're doing these things.
Dr. Al, too, we have a listener question for you from Stephen Civadelic, who is asking, hey, Dr. Al, are there any similarities in form or function of the Cyprianic mirror to other mirrors detailed in other grimoires, like the mirror of Anael in the Grimoire Verum, the mirror of Azrael in the Book of St. Cyprian, or the mirror of the 7 planets found in the Picatrix?
Oh, these are great questions. In a way, there are definitely some similarities. The mirror, and again, I was trying to get at this earlier, like the sense of it being kind of a Swiss Army knife of cardinal conjuration, if we want to put it like that, that it is less of a scrying device. You actually, one of the ways you use it isn't gazing into it, it's putting a glass of water on it, or putting it on top of a glass of water, or sandwiching a glass of water between it and some of the seals that you've made in parchment. It's more of an operating setup, for want of a better term, than it is a mirror to gaze in. I do find some interesting parallels with the Picatrix mirror of the 7 planets, because it is another complete taxonomy of all the things, right? You aren't just collecting the 7 planets out of a sense of armchair completism, right? You are doing it because you need to be able to work on every day of the week, and you need to be able to potentially see and deal with maladies and solutions that could come from that in any planetary flavor. We see the same thing here with the 4 directions being represented. They are the 4 corners of the world, and they're by extension everything between those corners, right? So it is a way of being able to potentially widen our purviews of efficacious work. It's a way, again, of covering all the bases, not just out of this sense of completing everything and now you are a special person because you have a secret decoder ring from every planet, but because you are able to then work between them and even start incorporating like chords, being able to work with 2 planets at once, or being able to work with 2 courts of the directions about a certain thing, and seeing how the spirits move between them and those directions and those modalities. So again, it's also a dance because you are moving through this operating system that is keyed to the directionality of your spirit room and the fetishes hanging there on the walls there, which can also follow you around because you're doing that work with yourself as the crux of that crossroads. You are putting yourself in that position of responsibility again, and of being the one who calls and has to deal with what responds to the call.
That wonderful explanation, Dr. Al, actually leads right into another listener question that we have for you about building relationships from Jorge Rivera. And Jorge is asking and saying, greetings, Dr. Al and all. I'd like to get a better understanding of how Cyprianic magicians developed their relationship with Cyprian himself. This seems to me like it might be very similar to the relationship between practitioners of Palo Mayombe, like me, and their Nefumbe, the spirit of a dead person that was once a Palero priest or priestess. The Nefumbe becomes a spirit mentor to the Palero, a spirit guide, if you will, family. So Jorge is asking, Dr. Al, do Cyprianic magicians come to see Cyprian that way?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. Oh, hey, I'm always delighted to get to speak to paleros and santeros and a variety of practitioners and seeing how they approach this thing. So again, evincing like this looks like something that we do that is this kind of way and has this kind of approach and means this kind of thing to us, rather than like, a concentration on what kind of, materia or things like that. So this is a wonderful discussion. I'm wary of speaking for all Cyprianic magicians because, at least in my personal experience, we all seem a pretty idiosyncratic, and we don't always seem the most gregarious either. Like what I do with Cyprian is what I do with Cyprian, and I'm happy to share that with pals and colleagues and folks. But I'm wary of saying like this is what everyone does now. I'm also wary of saying that about historical practitioners. We can definitely frame the Grimoire magicians, the cunning folk, and the practitioners of the early modern period that I'm most familiar with as Cyprianic in the sense of them feeling like they were doing a magic of Cyprian. Like, that's fair to say. But I don't know if they would consider themselves Cyprianic magicians. There may be some exceptions to that. Arthur Gauntlet, for instance, whose grimoire from the Sloane manuscripts was published relatively recently. That working book of a professional London cunning man pretty much opens with the instructions of Cyprian, which are a set of general things that you should bear in mind if you're doing magic. Things like make sure that you've got all your timings right, but also some kind of noti for the heart of the conjurer as well. Don't doubt yourself. Make sure that you have cleansed and done confession so that you are in peace of mind, so that you aren't distracted by worrying about something that you may have done wrong or feel bad about, right? So does Gauntlet consider himself a magician in the line of Cyprian? That's a matter of what his ghost is going to say when you talk to him. So I can talk about what my experience of that is, but that's also at that point, what he's telling me, or what that spirit that turns up looking like Arthur Gauntlet tells me about it. So are these practitioners, might not call themselves that, but they are absolutely working off magics that are said to have been by Cyprian, whether this is the art of Cyprian's mirror, or as I mentioned earlier, the Book of Donnell has a bunch of summoning noti. They cite, as Cyprian saith, when I summoned Asmodai, I did this, but not this. So I hope that's a useful way of at least beginning framing that and what a relationship with Cyprian himself might be. As I say, there's a mass of Cyprian that the De Necromantia insists on. And we also authorize our works by, not just authorize, but like do grimoire magic based off books that are said to have been his as well. The Book of the Offices of the Spirits underlies what will become the Lemegeton and the various things that get published as Goetias. And it is said to be Cyprian's book. So we deal with Cyprian as a magician ancestor, definitely.
Dr. L2, we have a listener question for you from someone who you mentioned earlier on in the podcast and a previous guest and a magician himself, Adley Nichols. And Adley is asking and saying, quote, both the rise of the use of hand mirrors for magic and the shift in the Four Kings becoming more accessible is fascinating to me. In the medieval era, we see evidence that while the Four Kings were accessible, it was very difficult to conjure them relying on complex regalia, tools, rings, sigils, and conjuration methods specifically for them. While it's more apparent that the Cyprian traditions are more responsible for the popularity of the use of these Four Kings, Adley is asking, can you, Dr. Al, tell us a bit more about the shift that took place within the Cyprian traditions that made the Four Kings so much more accessible over time? While this may be more of a question of social mentalities of the period, Adley says, I'd like to better understand what made the Cyprian magicians so different when it comes to the implementation of the Four Kings in Conjuration.
So it's always lovely to talk to Adley about this. And I'm really grateful for his time and friendship and the things he shares as a colleague and the conversations that he's shepherding and curating and sparking and things. He's laid out this brilliantly, right? Like the kind of themes we've been talking about with the medieval king work looks immensely complicated. It's full of, like he says, a lot of regalia, a lot of very particular timings, a lot of things done over a very long period of time, things that can only be done at a certain time of the year, once a year, things like that. So we're seeing this shift to where by the early modern period, and again, to cite a work I've already bigged up, The Magic of Rogues by Frank Claassen and Sharon Hubbs Wright is really showing that the Four Kings are a lot more present in the kind of folk grimoiric work of cunning folk, the local village wizards and wise women and spirit workers referred to as doing a kind of cunning craft. They seem to be working it a lot more loosely. There are plenty of the regalias and the operations, and some of them are indeed durational over many days. But dream work starts to come in. And again, I'm not saying that there's no dreaming in medieval magic, but the dream work starts to take more of a precedent. And again, Magic of Rogues really highlights that plenty of these folks seem to have been engaging in some form of this. There's this talk of like the spirit room or the conjuring chamber that one 16th century cunning man was using. And the popularity of it specifically seems to be, for my money, spurred by the formulation of the set of texts subgenre of grimoire genre, the Thesaurus Spiritum, the treasury of spirits, because this, at its heart, has a couple different versions of it, but at its heart, it is about doing a stripped down early modern version of very complicated medieval ritual chamber magic with the four principal spirits that seem to be the four kings, the four kings, the four regents. And this seems to be the thing that gets popular. Magic of Rogues actually cites, like Clarkson and Wright, cite a particular report of this working group of cunning folk and treasure hunters who have an argument about whether or not the scepter, which is a big deal in the De Necromantia and the Thesaurus Spiritum texts, whether it should be gilded or it should be bare. And the fact is we have manuscripts of both of those. Again, talk about like grimoires being a little bit different for everyone. We have manuscript variations where it's specified the scepter must be gilded, and versions where it says that it absolutely can't be gilded and must be bare. So neither of these people arguing about what tool they need is wrong. And also neither of them are like, someone with access to a massive occult library or anything like that, right? They're relatively like normal practitioners, whatever that means. So the thing seems to be that the popularity of the Thesaurus Spiritum type texts seems to really highlight the use of, we can see certain tools and of in general applying a sense of needing to work with the four principal spirits to get at the other ones.
Well, and Dr. Al, this ties into something that you just mentioned a moment ago, which is a listener question from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking, I would love to hear Dr. Al talk a bit about the Thesaurus Spiritum or Treasury of Spirits. And Douglas is asking, what makes something a Thesaurus Spiritum? Does it need to be attributed to Roger Bacon? Does it have to have Cyprian in there somehow? Why don't we yet have a book, Douglas asks, compiling and comparing all of these treasuries of spirits?
That's a super great question, Douglas. For a start, I think it might be, I hope it's not too wishful thinking to think that we probably will see a Thesaurus Spiritum book sooner rather than later, as grimoire scholarship has improved both from access to texts and from new material and methodologies being elucidated by practitioners and scholars and academics of this stuff. We're zoning in a lot more on what people are actually doing with this stuff and what was important to them. And it's looking like in some of the more recent scholarship that the Thesaurus Spiritum is really important. I'm thinking again of the recent book, The Magic of Rogues on Cunning Folk. The subtitle, sells it right. Necromancers in Early Tudor England. Yes, I'm on board. I'm on board. I was already going to love this book. But one of the things it points out is just how many people seem to be using a version of the Thesaurus Spiritum to do stuff. I think we were just talking about the specific use of the particular tools and protocols and regalia of more medieval Four Kings work. But we see, again, the Thesaurus Spiritum being a kind of, seems a stripped down version. What is it in terms of its genre? Sometimes it's as broad as the Key of Solomon, which is historian Owen Davies has pointed out. When we see mention of it, we need to be careful to not assume we know exactly what's in it, because it could just be like a brand name recognition for that's a magic book, right? So the Baconian grimoires do have something to them other than the allegedly being written by Roger Bacon. They mention sacrifice a little bit more. And there's even, as I've talked about, even seems to be some workings of making wax effigies of animals and offering those to certain unclean spirits. There are other little bits and pieces, the use of a sword, the use of a plate with a tetragrammaton, the fourfold name. There are other bits and pieces. So far, we have a couple of particular manuscripts of this treasury of spirits. We have Welcome 110 at the Chetham Library. We have Mun A459. And then we also have Sloane 3853 and additional manuscript 36674. And both of those were transcribed and published in the 80s by Michael Albion MacDonald as the De Necromantia, which is a wonderful resource. Sadly, it's in one of those, this is a personal matter, it's printed in that like Gothic black letter font that makes your brain bleed after a while, unfortunately. No. But that's about in some places, and I'm told is floating around as a PDF on the internet. Do with that what you will. But no, hopefully we will see a version of it coming out. It seems that a lot of cunning folk were using it. A lot of magicians of the 16th century seem to have been influenced by it, shall we say.
Also, as well, this is something that you touched on before. We do have a listener question for you from T. And T is asking and saying, hi, Dr. Cummins. Can you talk a bit about the practical relationships and hierarchy between the three chiefs of hell and the four kings?
So when we talk about the practical relationships and hierarchy between the three chiefs and the four kings, people are often asking, like, what order do I work with them? How do I integrate them both into my ritual chamber and things? If you're working with the three chiefs from an angle of the Grimoire Verum, where you're working with Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth rather than Satan as the third, although Satan also has relationality to the four kings more directly, that's a way to do it. I'm more familiar with Verum. That's the kind of operating basis, and Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, its predecessor. Those inform my work a lot more. The Verum actually begins by saying you can and should be making offerings and working with the spirit of the East. And it specifies the spirit. So there is our in. And if you're interested in that, I would really recommend looking at Jakey's work, Jake Strand-Kent's work, especially Testament of Cyprian the Mage, where he's talked more about the four kings and the three chiefs. I think what's helpful in framing what works for your work and the traditions that whoever is listening is drawing on with this stuff is that it's helpful for me to think about the three chiefs, as we put it, in hell, and ruling and being the power source and center of this all and the authorizing agents of it all, and the four kings being the way of grounding the infernal in the world, of, again, orientation, of sending things out in the world, of being the deployment as opposed to the power source. And so I think that's a helpful way of thinking about both those organizations, hierarchies, arrangements of things, and of spirits. And so if you are seeking to do more one than the other, then that's going to inform how they inform each other. But certainly I know a couple colleagues who call the kings and then go to the chiefs. I've done both and had moderate success with both ways.
Dr. Al, to your point, in terms of the experiential aspect of this, moving to more of a kind of an overall theoretical question to me, which is, we have a listener question from Sean, who is asking, Dr. Al, what motivation could an infernal king, chief, or authority have for giving humans power over their demons? One might presume, Sean says, that the demons generally despise human beings.
It's always worth us asking, like, of ourselves at least, like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this, right? This is an awful lot of effort to just get freaked out by, cutlery flying across the room or what have you. It's worth us thinking about what's in it for spirits, right? And that's worth it from an empathic point of view. It's also worth it from a cynical or just realistic view of again, not being taken for a ride, hopefully. Because there are plenty of spirits that will turn up and promise you all sorts of things if you give them nice things, who have no intention of fulfilling that. You raise an excellent point. What's this ancient, powerful thing want to do with us? I guess the flip side of that is I'm not sure I know how to think like an ancient, powerful demon. Not yet, anyway. Maybe I'm getting there. So the flip side of it is I don't know how useful it is to ponder on trying to work out how they think, if that makes sense. What we can deal with is who turns up and how they treat us, and what we do to ensure that we are treated well in a variety of ways. If we're talking more, technically, what does the demon get out of it? Well, again, depending on the grimoire you're working with, it's pretty clear. Verum, they're getting a goat out of it, which they seem to enjoy. There's notions here of, like, why does an ancient spirit need sacrifice? Which is a great question, and one that seems to have a variety of answers depending on the spirit and what they're doing. So I think trying not to presume too much about what spirits are going to be like when they turn up is useful, while also knowing that if they turn up and do something utterly outrageous or out of character, maybe you aren't dealing with, or out of genre, we might say, of the particular system or tradition you're working, then we might know that we have a spirit pretending to be another spirit.
As well, Dr. Al, you were touching earlier on the malleability and just the variation in the conjurations. And we have another listener question for you from Sean that touches on this. And Sean is asking and saying, some texts on magic, like Sloane MS 3824 or David Rankin's Treasure Spirits book, claim longer conjurations are more efficacious, like those in Rudd's Angel Invocations. Does Dr. Al agree with this? And are the invocations in MS Sloane 3850 relatively long or short compared to those in the Goetia, for example?
So this is another interesting point and a great question that means we get to talk again about the way that conjuration protocols have a ritual script, but then also incorporate all sorts of if this, then that kind of flowchart stuff, right? So if the spirit hasn't turned up, you do it again 3 times. If it still hasn't turned up, you can move to a malediction. That's just one version, and that's the one people are most familiar with. But there are lots of other versions of do this, and then you can do this or this. Like becomes like a kind of skill tree kind of thing. But there are modular rites that kind of work a little bit more in that manner. So that's to say that it's going to depend. I don't think there's necessarily an answer that longer conjurations are always better or that shorter conjurations are always better. It's going to depend on the spirit you're working with. It's going to depend on weather conditions, the planetary virtues at present, the kind of work you're trying to do. There are definitely spirits that respond to the perfect pronunciation of like 12 pages of appeals to Christ, right? Then there are other spirits that are going to require very short passwords from you. But if you can't produce that password, you're done. And not like it'll come for you in the night, but like then the spirit's like, well, you can't come in, and, wanders off. So it depends on what kind of work you're doing, what kind of spirit you're working with. It also depends what kind of work you're trying to do. In my experience, longer conjurations tend to produce a more stately and potent kind of spirit or set of virtues that the spirit is drawing on in the conjuration. And the shorter ones tend to, unsurprisingly, produce spirit relationships and workings that are a lot more responsive. Unsurprisingly, I guess that's not rocket science. But sometimes you want the spirit to be a bit more responsive and you want to be able to correct in real time what's going on. And sometimes you just want to declare really formally, this is what I need to happen, and then send it out. So it also depends what manner of working you want to do, as well as what goal you have in your working, if that makes sense. But hopefully this again is getting at conjurers to swear together. And if you meet with the spirit in that handshake, some spirits you're going to need to cajole or be more persuasive with or more direct, or, it's going to depend on the work. But hopefully I don't just want to keep saying, oh, it depends what you're doing. What I want to get at here is that conjuration should be dynamic. That's the approach I'm looking for. It should be able to respond to what is going on and pivot on that stuff and weaponize it or operationalize it towards the goal you're after.
There is a certain unique music, there's a unique dance, a certain dynamism that people need to respect before they just assume they can do everything cookie cutter,
Right. And those are good places to start as well. And there are many of those long conjurations also say, do the long conjuration, but like it'll probably turn up before you're finished, or it'll probably turn up before you've done it 4 times or 3 times or whatever it is. So I don't mean to create an artificial division between there's standing at a podium and just reading, and there's, doing capoeira with the spirit on the other side. Like I'm not trying to cartoonishly divide up the only 2 ways of doing it, and they're completely different and they never meet in the middle. But what I am saying is you can be paying attention to what's going on and what you're feeling, mid-sentence as well. And the feel of the words and the sense of where you find yourself emphasizing things can also be ways of not just calling the spirit, but feeling the presence of the spirit. Noticing one's own speaking voice changing as an instrumentation of measurement of the spirit's presence and movement and virtues and things like that. So conjuration is not just about pulling a spirit to you. It's also about feeling the rope of the spirit pulling back.
Is there anything else that you'd like to leave listeners with? Either things they should keep in mind before they pick up a copy of the book, or as they're going through it, or practicing it themselves? Oh,
sure. Yeah. It's a short booklet that, as I say, the idea was to publish this experiment and to show, some appendices of like, here are bits from other grimoires, like the silken cloth or the linen cloth from the Key of Solomon. And again, I want to thank you, set me up and I got distracted. I want to thank Joseph H. Peterson for all his help with Aubrey Manuscript 24, that I pulled a particular version of the cloth that you're meant to wrap your tools up in from him. And he was really, really helpful. So thank you so much, Joseph. You are an absolute star. Thank you for all the hard work you do and answering questions like from grubby fellows like me. So what to bear in mind about it? It's very short. It's a particular operation. I thought about it as a mini grimoire because it has that sense of once you've built this thing, you can call in any direction, right? That we've talked about today. But it's more of an experiment, and I hope it gives folks a useful set of showing as well as telling. a little bit about what work might look like. And again, the tension between wanting to say this is exactly what I did and not wanting people to feel like they've been set up for failure if they do exactly what I do and get different results, because again, they're going to have different spirits to me and different experiences, and that's good and proper. So again, exploring that tension of how do you write about something that helps someone step into their own responsibility in their practice without telling them they can do whatever they want or telling them they have to do everything you did. So exploring that tension has been interesting. So I'm also excited for people to try this stuff out and get back to me about what they did. This is also slightly sharing this stuff as a kind of open source research pod, right? Been chatting to a couple of colleagues about what they've been doing with it, and that's been really great as well. I also wanted to say thank you to Urs and Dis at Hadean Press for putting it out on a very particular ritual timeframe I had that didn't give them an awful lot of time, and they scrambled together and produced something really great. So I'm really grateful to the Hadeans for their continued support. Thank you.
Oh, that is so lovely to see, not only the collaboration with esteemed gentlemen such as yourself and Joseph H. Peterson, but also, yes, the wonderful work that happens every day at Hadean Press is just absolutely excellent. And Dr. Al, this kind of touches on, of course, you're always working on something. You are the quintessential Renaissance man, but can you give us any hints on any other projects or areas of research that you're working on?
Sure, yeah. There's so many more things I'm always happy to talk about or mention that I'm working on, over a pint. Now, these days, that's mostly Zoom, seeing friends and things rather than in physical pubs as plague continues to rage. But I'm also wary of you want to share like, oh my gosh, I found this fascinating thing in this Grimoire I was working on. But maybe it's not time for that thing yet. What I'm working on at the moment, I have a couple long form courses starting in March. I have a necromancy for beginners class that I think I mentioned earlier. That's a 5-part series on starting working with necromancy. So beginning with ancestors and going through dealing with like various graveyard protocol and things like that, and a little bit on dealing with restless dead. I'm also doing a series called Everyday Planetary Sorcery, which is a 7-part series for morbid anatomy, which is just a class a month. And we're going to get together and look at some of the folk planetary workings and kind of ways that we can fold astrological magic and astrological spirit work into our everyday lives as much as we can be prepared for the next super conjunction or particular aspect or election. What can we do in the periods between elections? Looking at things like planetary food and color, garments and locations and the children of the planets, working with the foot track of a lawyer for doing the Jupiterian stuff. And also looking at the ways in which certain planetary talismans like the number squares, like the cameas, the planetary number tables, how they have a lot of folk magic applications as well, empowering materia by touching them to it and then taking that and like spreading powders over particular places to bring that planet's influence and things. So looking at like folky magics and down-home dirt sorcery with the stars for that series. And then I also have a bunch of other classes on various aspects of necromancy and cunning craft coming up from March onwards. And I continue to work on, a bunch of grimoires that I would love to talk about more, but I'm going to wait to have their moment. Continuing to head up editing the Folk Necromancy and Transmission series with Jesse and Dr. Jen at Revelor as well. And we've got some exciting announcements coming soon there. Edition of Albuni's Shams Ma'arif is out soon, and we're very excited for folks to dig into that. We have some nigromantic trolldom stuff coming too, some more stuff on the Swedish Black Books tradition I've been working on. Other bits and bobs, including a bunch of Four Kings stuff as well. And of course, clients and classes and talisman batches and making inks and all sorts of other things like that.
What does it mean to be a service magician, especially in today's day and age where you might have some people who might not know what that is or how to navigate those waters? What is this whole thing about being a service magician? And what are some things that you'd like to, have people keep in mind about if they are approaching, say, a magician who it is their trade, that they offer these services as part of their craft? What would you like people to know?
For me, so for a start, if you're not familiar with the term, service magician is someone that does magic for the services of others, either for money or other kinds of support or exchange. So many people, if you read professionally, right, if you read cards or divine for people professionally, for many that would count as you're doing a magic of some kind. But really, when we're into like folk magician territory, of a service magician is someone that is actively working with spirits or doing spell work or operative sorcery, not, quote, just reading. I think that's interesting because I don't think the divisions between divination and sorcery are often as concrete as theory might say. I have a thing with my dear friend, Professor Charles Porterfield, another folk magician and service magician, that often we really like the clients who approach us like a plumber, like, hey, my pipe's busted. I know something's up. I'm flooded in spirits that shouldn't be here. Can you come and do an assessment? And so, you go and do an assessment either in person or at a distance through divination. And that assessment costs because you have to go and do that thing. And that's time and expertise and whatnot. And then you give them a price about, this is what it's going to cost to fix that pipe. Or, I want to build an extension on my spirit room and I want you to come and help me assess what it is. So I really like those kinds of clients who have a very clear idea about what their practice is and what they need help with in that thing. You don't need to be able to build a TV and have a degree in physics to be able to watch a TV or even to be a TV critic, right? That's not what your job is. That's not what you're engaging with that thing for. So not everyone needs to be able to do everything. And so service magicians are also just, there are plenty of magicians I know who I make talismans for who could make a way better thing than I could, or at least a thing way more keyed to their practice because they're the one doing it, right? They know all their secrets, but who don't have the time, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of like being the right person, being Johnny on the spot. I think one of the difficulties for clients, especially those who haven't grown up in a magical culture, and I don't mean like whose grandma wasn't whispering the prayers to the goddess in their ears from the age of, 1, but people that have grown up in the, quote, disenchanted West, who sometimes need more help working out what it is, what's possible with magic, what isn't, what takes time, what we can accurately say about a situation at various points, depending on how much divination has been done or not done, right? How we can assess a problem and then look at solutions, how we can pull good strategies from that assessment without even lighting candles or what have you. So for me, I think it's important that people understand that professional magicians are here to help them in their practice and not necessarily to enforce a practice on them, that there's no shame in getting a second opinion on something. If your divination is squirrely about something, it's often a really good idea. Just as you are the best person to do your practice because you know all your secrets, you are also sometimes too close to see the wood for the trees, right? And so sometimes it's great to get a second opinion. I also really like working with people who are just getting started out and would like have a bunch of things they'd like to do and want to prioritize which thing they do first, right? Like how to hack through the reading lists most effectively, or also like which parts of your practice can most immediately bring you benefit, right? It may well be that you are indeed called by, the spirits of Mercury to be a great translator. But if you need to work with, the moon first to deal with, some sleep disorder you have so that you can have the energy to then be a wonderful translator, it's more helpful to know that you should do that lunar work first, right? So I really like consulting for people, helping them get a second pair of eyes on a thing, helping them work out bespoke solutions to particular things they're dealing with, general emphases of how to develop a practice when it's got plateaued. And then also, yes, occasionally actual crises where something is very wrong. A spirit is somewhere it shouldn't be and is doing things to your pets that it shouldn't do. There are certain points where it becomes a little bit more of whether it shades of it being more of a kind of paramedic role. But very often I am consulting for people who are in the business of working out how to do what they do better. And it's a joy to get to support people doing that.
Service magician, author, historian, poet, discussing his latest tome, The Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings, Dr. Alexander Cummins. Dr. Al, thank you just so much for sharing your generous time and also your wisdom today. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, bless you. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me back. Thanks for having great questions. And I love that we can kind of occasionally spark off each other and start going off on, not tangents, but like, I love hearing about your thoughts on this stuff as well. And thank you for continuing to cultivate community spaces where people can feel free and empowered to ask questions of the people you've got on. It's a really great way of connecting people up. It's great for me to be able to answer things that actual real people want to know, rather than just, that supply demand thing of like trying to work out what it is that people want you to talk about. Right. Again, we're also back to that thing of like, when you speak from your own practice and you are as honest with yourself as you can be, then you don't need to remember things. That Mark Twain quote that you quoted when we were talking earlier, right? If there are too many lies going on, if you are deceiving yourself about your practice, like, that's way too much effort.
Right, exactly. If you're telling the truth, you don't have to remember anything, right?
That's it. There we go. Yeah.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, as a contemporary cunning man, Dr. Al is so refreshing. He shares both scholarly insights, but also deep, practical applications of grimoires from hundreds of years ago. I mean, for example, have any of you ever put gold, frankincense, and myrrh under your tongue as part of a ritual? Actually, if you have done that, I do want to know, so please message me on Patreon about your experience. But also, Dr. Al illuminates what a spiritual hierarchy actually means, and also how the four regions of the four directions can be engaged with. In his construction of specific spirit thrones or focal points in the four directions for the four kings, Dr. Al also shows us how we can show fidelity to the grimoires, to follow the process as it were, but also to have deep room for exploration and modifications based on our own individual approaches and based on feedback from the spirits. A huge thanks to Dr. Al, and a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. You are all so amazing. Without you, the podcast would not exist and continue to grow in new and interesting ways. And so if you'd like to enjoy some extra perks and bonus materials, please consider becoming a super cool and secret Glitch Bottle supporter on patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, honor the four regions, and keep the light.